You're watching State and Local. Welcome back. I'm Anne-Marie Battistone, and of course this is Norfolk Public Access. And my guest is back again. I'm delighted to have him. Dylan Hayre, who is running for State Senate against Richard Ross. And by the way, I have contacted Richard Ross's office to offer him the opportunity to come on. So I just wanted to mention that. But today we have Dylan. Dylan, oh, thank you so much for coming back on.
Thank you. Of course.
Congratulations. That was a close. That was a close race, wasn't it?
It was. No, it was a hard-fought race. It was two good candidates, and we were excited. We we knew all along that we had confidence in our field operation, and we were excited about what we were doing, especially the last few weeks. The number of doors we were knocking, number of people we were talking to. But it was definitely close, and it proves that in those hard-fought races we can win just on the strength of our field operation and our organization. So we were very proud of it.
Now, before I forget, I think I'm right about this. I believe somebody named somebody from the Plainville Democratic Committee wanted to arrange a big debate.
Yep.
With, I think it was the Republican and the Democrat town committees from Plainville, Norfolk, and Rentham. Have you heard anything about that? Because I heard about that, and they haven't finalized it. Do you know when that might happen, or?
You know, let me just say this. I have made it very clear to Senator Ross and to media outlets that I am happy to accept as many debates as possible. I would love to have had a debate in every single town in the district. So far, we have 2 scheduled. Unfortunately, the senator opted to pull out of a forum that was sponsored by the St. Vincent de Paul Society of Attleboro.
And when was that going to be?
That was going to be on October 22nd, I believe.
Uh-huh.
And he declined to participate in that.
Oh.
I said I'd be happy to participate even still. This debate that you're talking about is some folks in Plainville, Rentham, Norfolk, that area. We're hoping to organize a debate co-sponsored by the Democrat, Republican town committees, and of course hosted by the Metro West Daily News.
Oh, okay.
In fact, the editor of the Metro West Daily moderated our debate in Norfolk for the primary, so we were hoping he'd do it again. And last I know, they are waiting on the senator to let us know if he'd be willing to participate in that.
Do they have a date, or?
I think we're waiting on the senator to get back to us.
So there were some dates put forward?
I don't know. I stayed out
Okay.
of it. It's not, I'm happy to do it whenever, wherever.
And also, any events coming up before we get into our discussion? Do you have any events?
We do. We have a few great events coming up. We have a couple of GOTV rallies. We're in the process of planning one now with Congresswoman Catherine Clark. We're having a fundraiser in Franklin with Norfolk County Sheriff Michael Bellotti. So we have a few events, and we'll roll out the details. We're still ironing out the final details as far as location and time, but those are going to be in the next couple weeks.
All right, so nothing that you'd want us to post right now on
No,
this show.
what I'd ask people to do is check out the website, dylanhayre.com.
Oh, all right.
All the information will certainly be up there. We'll also put it on Facebook and on Twitter, so people have an opportunity to find out about it.
Okay, now you came in today, you wanted to discuss some votes that had been taken that you took issue with. And I tried to do a little bit of research here. So just, you can jump in and start wherever you'd like.
Sure.
To talk about those.
Sure. I mean, I know, first of all, I'll say thank you for doing the research you did. And I will say I wish it were a little easier for voters to understand the process and the bills and the language of the bills. And it's one thing I've talked about, and you know this from the beginning of my campaign, is finding a way to make the State House and certainly the processes within the State House a lot more accessible. So I appreciate the work you did, but obviously it should be a lot easier for folks to understand what's happening up there and what's getting done or not getting done.
Well, if people wanted, I did finally find something called Legiscan. It's Legiscan. It's part of the state government where everything's listed, and there's like a very brief, little couple of lines. But it's better than better than nothing, and you see what's upcoming and processing. So okay.
No, but there are a couple votes that I think voters need to know about that are important. I mean, let's start out by saying that this race for me is about one simple thing. It's about what are we doing to support working families? What are we doing to create opportunity for folks across the district? One of the most important things that we can do is make sure that folks have good jobs that pay good wages. I mean, we can look at the data that shows that a good wage takes care of a lot of issues within a family. We can just look at our own personal lives and anecdotes we know from the people we know about how much important it is to have a good job that pays a good wage and how much that matters to someone trying to raise a family or support a family. So as you know, there was a big debate this year to raise the minimum wage to $11 an hour incrementally, and it would get there by 2017. Mm-hmm. My position was clear from the beginning. I was supported a higher minimum wage. I think it's important that, like I said, we support working families. We find a way to help folks earn a living. I know that there were some concerns raised by small businesses, and I've said time and time again, we do need to make Massachusetts business friendly. We do not do that on the backs of working men and women. I think there are other things we can look at to make that a possibility in Massachusetts. And keep in mind, too, even if you're earning $11 an hour, if you worked 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, you're making a little under $23,000. That's not a lot of money even still. So it's still some work left to do. Sorry.
Now, in your district, I mean, how you feel about it is, part of your, your philosophy, your worldview. But in your district, is that so much of an issue? I mean, I know the last time you came on, you were talking about, working families and, fighting for. But percentage-wise, how many people in your district are in that kind of a situation where they would be looking for that minimum wage, other than young people with, summer jobs, or people with, second jobs, or part-time jobs?
Well, two things about that.
It's a fairly well-to-do district, wouldn't you say, overall?
There's a couple things about that. Number one, it's hard to figure out the town-by-town percentage because that data is not actually out there. It's not easy to accumulate. There are groups that have done analysis of how much a minimum wage would impact a particular county. And this district's made up, as I know, of 3 separate counties, and so you try to break it out from there. It's a big number. It's hundreds of thousands of people across the state who'd be impacted by it, and certainly thousands of families in this district who'd be impacted by it. And there's actually a lot of misperceptions about minimum wage, one of which, is the fact that it only applies to young seasonal workers. In fact, the majority of minimum wage workers are older folks, are working women, are women who are trying to support or raise a family on their own, people who need this as a means to a living. So it's not just young folks. In fact, young folks are not even the majority of minimum wage earners in this state. Young folks are certainly a significant block. But even then, for a lot of young folks who are working minimum wage jobs, it's become, due to a lot of conditions, more than just a summer gig. It is now a vital piece of being able to support their family. It's a vital piece of being able to pay for textbooks, being able to afford having a car, being able to save up to pay down what will be massive college loans. So no matter who you are, no matter how old you are or where you work, minimum wage has an added significance now that it hasn't had in a long, long time.
Now, the older people working, would they be people that are supplementing Social Security, perhaps?
No, I'm talking in between. I'm talking young, you're
not talking...
Yeah, we're talking like 30 to 50-year-old folks, a lot of whom are single women.
Because, what I had heard when this was all going around was that, in fact, it was not people supporting families on minimum wage. I mean, surely in some parts of the state, obviously in some parts of the state, in some sectors, that's going to be the case. But I mean, it's just, it's kind of disheartening how, you listen to 2 different reports.
Yeah.
And there's this disparity. It's very discouraging how things are, whether it's spin or
Right.
I don't know what, how different, because I had heard just, the opposite, which is why I brought that up.
Well, then let's cut through it then, right? And let's say that, let's just agree on the fact that no matter who's earning minimum wage, it should be a wage that helps you earn a decent living. Minimum wage, let's keep in mind, was intended to be something very simple. When it was proposed throughout the New Deal era, when it was proposed as part of that whole package, it was always intended to be a wage where if you worked 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, you could earn a good living. So no matter who you are, that's the intent behind minimum wage. Now, over time, due to inflation, due to the wages having not kept up with inflation, due to the rising cost of living in this country and in this state particularly, minimum wage has fallen far short of that ideal. So if we can look at the numbers and we can try to interpret the data, and like I said, I think the data shows very clearly that minimum wage affects families in a way that most people don't realize. But even if the minimum wage were affecting different groups of people, the bottom line is no matter who it's impacting, we owe those folks a chance to earn a good living. That's what it's supposed to be. And that's why I would have supported having a minimum wage that, quite frankly, remember, the bill to raise the minimum wage, it had a very interesting name. The bill that we voted on, or that the legislature voted on, was called an Act to Restore the Minimum Wage. Now, that word restore is very important, because all this bill would have done is restore the minimum wage to the purchasing power it had over 30 years ago. It wouldn't have actually increased it beyond that. Right? You have to increase the dollar amount due to inflation, but it would have just restored the purchasing power. So we're actually trying to find ways to get back to where we once were. We're not actually even getting ahead that well. And quite frankly, having not indexed the minimum wage to inflation, we're going to be falling behind even further in the months and years ahead. So I think even the folks who might have some concerns about minimum wage, such as yourself or some of the small businesses, I think everyone realizes at the end of the day, we do at least need to restore it to what it used to be. And then hopefully we can have a discussion about where maybe it should be at the end of the day.
That's an
And to
interesting
go
point.
and to go back to the votes, so you know where I stand, and the bill was passed.
Excuse me, what is it right now? Do you happen to know what it is today? Minimum wage? Is it
Yeah,
seven
it's a little,
something?
Yeah, it's a little. I think it's around $8 an hour now.
Oh, it's that, okay.
So, and we're trying to get it up to 11. So the bill that passed, not only did the incumbent senator vote against that bill, he actually led the fight for an amendment that would have allowed seasonal teenage workers to be paid just 80% of minimum wage.
I did see that.
And that is that to me is an issue, given what we were talking about earlier, that for a lot of these folks, this is not just the summer gig that you do to kill 3 months of time in between classes. This is a vital piece of being able to support your family's income and build up your own income for what's coming.
And I'm not trying to defend it, but was the idea so that maybe more of them would be hired in the summer because that's when a lot of them are looking for
Well, I think
work?
the idea behind
that
it, the
they
intent
might take more
behind
people on?
Well, you'd think that would be the best case scenario. I think the unfortunate reality is that the senator let us know what the intent was. In an article recently, he said the reason not to raise the minimum wage is because it should only ever be a training wage. That's insulting to workers across the state. There's people who have been working minimum wage jobs for a decade. They're not training. They're working. They're trying to support their loved ones. And so for that to be the mentality of the person representing this district and these families, I think that's a problem for folks. And, that, to go back to your question, I think that unfortunately is the mentality that drives this type of debate about paying teenage seasonal workers less. They're training. It's a training wage. It's not. They need to earn the same as their peers. And quite frankly, the minimum wage is by definition a minimum. You're not supposed to start poking holes in the floor before you even build it. To weaken it in any way, I think, undermines the value that we're trying to put into it in the first place.
Well, do you think the fast food workers should be getting $15 an hour? I think that seems very high. I mean, when you put it against the skill, there are probably attorneys that are maybe they're working to help the poor, or quasi pro bono, that maybe aren't making a whole lot more than that, possibly in some parts of the United States. And so that seems like an awful lot on that. That's a national thing, though, right?
Well, then I would, and it's national, but it's local too. And I would simply ask, and you raised a great point, that there are other people who have, let's say, more education or more skills that aren't getting paid a lot more. Well, then the question becomes, are we really disappointed or upset that fast food workers want $15 an hour? Or is the real source of our angst the fact that a lot of other folks aren't getting a hell of a lot more than that? So everyone, I think, should be earning a little bit more than they are, right? That's the bottom line. Even at $15 an hour, you're not really making a great living. And again, fast food workers for a lot of folks seem kind of just, part-timers or, summer gigs, this and that and the other thing. There are people working those jobs who are trying to support a family, and even if they weren't, and like I said to you, even if they were just there for the summer, the point of the minimum wage is to be able to support a family for if you worked at the full time. So even if you only work at that job part of the time, you should be paid an amount where if you worked at the full time, you'd be able to earn a decent living. And quite frankly, had minimum wage kept pace not just with inflation, but had it kept pace with the rise of corporate salaries across this country, we'd be seeing a minimum wage over $30 an hour. There's been this widening gap and this widening disparity. I'm sure you've read about it. You feel it when you walk out the front door. You talk to people every day who are struggling. We just talked to a business owner down the road at a local pet supply store who sees the gap and sees it in his customers and sees it in the purchasing power of the folks who are coming into his store every day. There's a real problem here. There's a real issue here. And like I said, there's a lot of folks who would tell you to hold down people like fast food workers or teenage workers and say keep them where they're at. They don't need to be earning more. And my argument against that is that's not the source of the issue. The issue is that none of us, quite frankly, or many of us, are probably not getting paid what we deserve to be paid for the work we're doing.
But what's the domino effect of that? People who have run private businesses still have the opportunity to decide how many people are going to work for them.
Right. And
So
yeah, I guess there's
what happens there?
You could present this argument that there's a fear that if you raise the minimum wage to a certain point, employers are just going to lay off employees and cut
people
ranks.
are already people are already just keeping people part time because of the insurance issue.
Right.
And so a lot of people have been cut back to part-time.
So let's fix the insurance issue, right?
Well,
so let's talk about health insurance, right? Let's
mean,
talk about what we're doing. Let's talk about the fees on businesses. Let's talk about how hard it is to start a small business in some parts of this country. Let's talk about those problems, right? Let's fix those problems. And again, that goes back to what I said earlier.
Well, that was a requirement of the Affordable Care Act in terms of the number of employees and
Right.
how much insurance you had to offer them. And so, to be frank with you, I mean, I was kind of surprised that he didn't turn around and try to say that, there was put some. I mean, it seems ludicrous, but that put some kind of restriction on letting people go. I mean, I'm wondering if that's not going to be the next step, because that's what a lot of people did. And a lot of the new jobs are part-time.
Yeah. No, I think there are issues with how hard it is to maintain a workforce, especially for small businesses. That's not a laughing matter. That's not a trivial matter. We need to find a way to support small businesses. We need to find a way to help small businesses grow and to thrive here in Massachusetts. That has to be a priority for us. But I think there are things we can do, and there are ways that we can support that industry and that network of small businesses without asking workers to continue to take a hit and make a sacrifice that, quite frankly, is unfair to them and their families.
Well, it might be a question of taxes.
I mean, I think it's a question of tax predictability. I think there are things we need to do to make the picture a lot more clearer for businesses. I was speaking to a small business owner who owns who does a little summer camp thing in North Attleboro, and she was saying her biggest problem is that every year she's not even sure what the tax rate's going to be or what taxes are going to be implemented. And for example, we had recently the software services sales tax, which turned out to be a bit of a debacle at the State House. Where they introduced this tax as a way to fund a proposed transportation plan, and then immediately 2 weeks later, because businesses fought back, they withdrew it. Now, on one hand, I'm very glad that the State House was trying to invest in transportation. That's a good thing, and I'm glad they were willing to be responsive to some concerns that were raised. That's a good thing. But you can't live in a world as a small business where your taxes are one thing 1 week and another thing a week later. We need to be able to paint a long-term picture and paint that long-term forecast. We need to plan for long-term economics and fiscal health. And we need to do a better job of that with our tax structure, with our insurance structure, with our pension structure. We need to look at a lot of different areas right now where the state's struggling a little bit and say, what can we do to make sure that we're not only investing in our workers and investing in our businesses, but that we're making an environment where businesses can and want to grow and thrive.
I mean, the other thing, it's an unrelated issue, or somewhat unrelated issue, but the automatic gas tax, I think people, feel, and I think we talked about this before, that people don't like the idea of something just, automatically going up without people having to sit down and saying, I support this or I don't.
Right.
But now, do you want to move on to another vote, or did you want to? Was there anything more you wanted to?
No. I think the minimum wage vote is clear on its face. I don't think there's a lot of room for argument there. I think one of us believes we need to support working families, and the other one doesn't. And I think that choice is clear to voters.
Well, that's kind of oversimplifying. I mean, I think the concern. I think, prices are going up all the time, and I think if it's costing the business owners are just not going to take, right or wrong, they're not going to take that hit.
Right.
To have people buying less stuff in the store because prices have gone up to cover, their salaries.
So a couple things about that again. Number one, I think there's a lot of data that shows that when you pay people a wage where they can actually afford to buy the products they're making or selling, that's a good thing. You put money in people's pockets. They can spend that money. They will turn it back into investment in the economy. It's a cyclical cycle.
Well,
it's a cyclical thing. So will the prices at certain products go up? Yes, and there's been data to show that, for example, if you did pay fast food workers at $15 an hour, the price of a Big Mac would increase just marginally, to the point where most people probably wouldn't even notice it.
Is that what they said?
Yeah.
Marginally. Oh.
Because, think about how much they sell and think about the product, and quite frankly, think about the profits that a company like McDonald's turns over every single year anyway. But what you're doing is you are giving people more money on their own to put back into either that retail chain or another retail chain. You're giving people money to put back in the economy. And that's way, you're supporting businesses by supporting workers. And I think there's a lot of small business owners who understand that. Now, keep in mind, too, I met a woman from Wayland, and her story is one I've heard across this district. She runs a small video editing business. She actually has about 15 employees, and she pays them $20 an hour. That's a far above minimum wage, and that's a pretty decent
There must
wage.
be some skill involved, though, in that job that
Well,
she has to pay for.
even the entry level workers into her company are getting paid $20 an hour. She's welcoming young workers, new workers, training them and paying them that wage. And she's actually had to shut down part of her operation. And when she looked at the books, the reason wasn't because her wages were off the charts. The reason is because her healthcare costs were rising at an untenable rate. And she was no longer able to afford a lot of the coverage. And
That she was paying for them.
right, and she was no longer able to afford some of the costs associated with that.
So how did it all shake out then?
Well, she's still trying to retain as many workers as possible. I mean, she's trying to keep the wages where they are because she knows that that's a fair wage to pay. But she's also in the process now of working with other businesses to try to negotiate a lower rate. And that's what that's
To get into a group?
Exactly, and that's the position she's in.
That's what I was talking about.
And a lot of, like I said, I've met business owners in Rentham. I've met business owners in Attleboro, and they all say the same thing. For us, the wage is not the single biggest issue. The biggest issue for us is, predictability and accountability economically, making sure that we know what's going on Beacon Hill and what to expect, and making sure that the fees and the costs associated with business outside of the wages are manageable, whether it's startup fees or healthcare costs, or whether it's,
Electric bills.
Whether it's, quite frankly, losing customers on days because you can't drive down some of these roads because they're so pothole marked and bridges are down. And I live I live in Natick, and there's a bridge right by my house that's down and connects two main parts of Natick. Now it's all residential, so
But still.
I just imagine if there were just a small mom and pop grocery on the other side of that bridge, what would they have been doing right now? Because we weren't willing to invest in transportation. Now that's it's not for lack of investment, but it's an example of what happens when things go wrong. There's a lot of things, and you said, it's funny you said this a second ago, that the issues aren't related. These issues are all related. There's an interconnectedness here to these issues. And unless we are willing to take that comprehensive approach and think long term, and think about how we not only sustain a business, but how we sustain and strengthen a community, and what that means for people within that community. Unless we're willing to do that, I think we're going to keep having these problems year and year again.
So we're going to move on to voter ID.
Sure.
For photo IDs for
voters.
voting.
Sure. I think another significant policy difference between me and the senator. Let's start with this basic premise. We just came out of a primary where we had record low turnout both in the district and across the state. We need to find a way to engage voters, to make them excited about the campaigns of the candidates, to find a way to get them out. I think there are some problems we have, with making sure that we're making the voting process as accessible as possible. We just passed a bill that makes some of that a little easier, whether it's registration or early voting. I think those are important steps. But we do need to continue to find ways to encourage voters to get out to the polls. And I think anything we do that in any way dissuades voters from doing that, or makes it harder for voters to have access to our participatory democracy, anything we're doing down that path, I think, is the wrong step forward for Massachusetts and for the country as a whole. I know that voter ID has become an issue across the country. I know it's talked about by talking heads on cable every night. But here in Massachusetts, we need to have a real serious conversation about what we're doing to make voting accessible. Like I said, we took some good steps forward with the voting bill, with allowing early voting, that type of thing. To require photo ID to vote when we're not even making those photo IDs as readily accessible as we could be, I think is a real issue.
What's the story then with those state issued IDs?
As
that
far
have nothing
as
to do with the driver's license.
Yeah, I mean, you can get a state issued ID, and I mean that's fine. But the question becomes, how much does it cost? How easy is it for you to apply to get one? How long do you have to wait before you get one? Do people even know that those are available? Do people even know that state-issued IDs without licenses are an option? I mean, there's a lot of things we need to do to make people aware of the information.
The state needs to make that clear. You're right. I mean, I haven't heard anything. The only reason I happen to know about that is this friend of mine that can't vote because he's epileptic. But, the state, if they're that worried about people going in to vote, I mean, I don't think the situation of people not, I mean, I'm astonished at the number of people that don't register to vote or say they're not registered to vote. I don't know whether they just think everything's going to be fine and everything will roll along and they just don't go out to vote. But
I think in whether you look at locally, whether it's the bill that the senator proposed or whether you look nationally, I think when you're introducing photo ID laws, I think that is an attempt to dissuade people from being a part of the process, because I haven't seen a reason other than that to require these laws to be in effect.
Well, I don't. I mean, sure, you don't think that there aren't a lot of people voting that are illegal aliens that have no right to vote. I mean, you can't. I mean, maybe not. I don't know about
The
the
instances
situation
of
in
voter
Massachusetts.
fraud, whether it's undocumented immigrants trying to have access to the system or people voting twice, whatever it may be, the instances are incredibly low.
See, I wonder how much they even look into that.
Well, I think they do.
Because
I mean, I think people care. I think people who, whether it's town clerks, whether it's poll checkers, I think the people who are, basically running these elections and running these polls, these are people, many of whom I know, they care deeply about the sanctity of the democratic process. I think it's important for them to understand that we have a process that works and that is accountable and transparent.
Well, the other thing I think, to me, that term dog whistle.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, I just find it hard to believe that you have to assume that people, whether it's because they're minorities or they're older, are not capable of going through this, of caring enough to go through and say, I need an ID. What do I have to do? Call the town clerk's office. Go online. I mean, to me, that's almost kind of patronizing. And the argument has been that a lot of these folks that might be voting who are not entitled to vote are voting Democrat, and so it's a vote that would go in the direction that a lot of these folks want it to go.
Well,
because it is a partisan issue.
I think I think it's become a partisan issue because I think it's talked about in that light. I think if people are going to vote Democrat or Republican, it's because there's a message within that party that appeals to you. And quite frankly, when one party time and time again continues to find ways to dissuade people, whether it's Hispanic or Indian or whatever it may be, or brown or black, when one party continues to find ways to dissuade people from voting, that resonates with voters in a very palpable way. And I think they're going to vote for a party, whether it's Democrat or Republican, that wants them to be a part of the process no matter what their views are or what they believe. Now, the instances that we're talking about this mass problem in voter fraud, it's not a massive problem. Now, that being said, I understand the argument, isn't one instance of voter fraud enough for us to want to address it? Yes, I think so. But to require, because of a very minute sample of instances, that everyone now has to have a particular form of ID in order to access a ballot, I think is a hatchet where you need a scalpel. And I think the underlying tone of most of these proposals is, like I said, to discourage people from being a part of the process.
Well, how do we know it's minute? I mean, what is the source? What sources are we looking at to know that it's minute?
You can look at the sources you can look at the records we collect after every election, and they report instances of voter fraud. And you can look at the work that the clerks, and both locally and across the country, do to make sure we have make sure we have access to information. And it's a fraction of a percent of instances of voter fraud given the entire voting turnout. And like I said, we're living in a world where voter turnout is very, very sadly low as it is. So why are we making it any harder than it has to be for people to be a part of the process?
Okay, now just one last question because we only have about 45 seconds. Now, what about the pictures on the EBT cards?
There's data that shows that pictures on EBT cards actually do nothing for fraud. There's data across the country that shows that. If you want to crack down on EBT card fraud, there are better, smarter ways to do it. And all that really does is make it harder for, let's say, a mother to give her EBT card to a child and say, can you run to the store and get milk or groceries for me? You're making it impossible for her to do that for her children. So what you're doing is making people ashamed to be living in a situation by having their photo plastered all over it. You're introducing a piece of legislation that doesn't actually have an impact and doesn't actually do what you think it does. And you're making it harder for people who are living within that world to actually use the resources, what little resources we're giving them in the first place.
Well, I understand the example about handing it over to somebody in the family, but I mean, I don't think people don't seem to me to be very ashamed to be using these EBT cards.
I think I think
and there's
I would say
and every time they address these drug dealers, sometimes they have 2 or 3 cards because the cards are being used as equity or that's not the currency to buy drugs. So
if the issue then is fraud, there are ways that we can crack down on fraud. And if the issue is people criminally taking advantage of disenfranchised families and disenfranchised folks, then we need to crack down on the people who are doing that.
Well, listen, I don't mean to interrupt you.
No,
we've run out of time.
Of course.
But so thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was good. It was fun. We'll do it again.
And thank you for watching State and Local. I'm Anne-Marie Battistone, and please watch us again. We're going to have some more interesting interviews coming up. My guest was Dylan Hayre. He's running for State Senate on November 4th.